They had come for God, for gold, and for the cold, hard right to tell their neighbors what to do. Forget the romanticized portraits of powdered wigs and lofty pronouncements. The true engine of American liberty, the one that would eventually fuel a revolution and structure a republic, was not found in the marble halls of Philadelphia. It was built, splinter by splinter, in the stark, unyielding wilderness of 17th-century Massachusetts Bay, in a drafty meeting house with a floor of packed earth and a roof that perpetually leaked every time the New England sky wept. In the year 1641, the world was ruled by kings, emperors, and distant divine mandate. An average farmer or tradesman in England was a subject, his life governed by men he'd never see, laws he'd never debate, and taxes he couldn't refuse. To even imagine a different system, one where the common man held the reins, was to flirt with sedition, or worse, the gallows. But here, in the frost-bitten settlement of Watertown, just across the Charles River from the fledgling Boston, an impossible idea was taking root. Imagine the scene. The air is thick with the scent of pine smoke and unwashed wool. Outside, the howl of a winter wind promises snow. Inside, 30 or 40 men, freemen as they called themselves, are crammed onto rough-hewn benches. These aren't aristocrats. They are carpenters, millers, shoemakers, and men who still carry the rough-hewn calluses of a life spent wresting a meager living from the unforgiving soil. At the head of the room stands Thomas Dudley, one of the colony's sternest magistrates. He's there to preside over the formal election of new officers, but more importantly, he's there to keep a firm Puritan grip on things. Dudley and his peers in the General Court, the colony's central government, believe governance should flow down from the educated and the devout. But tonight, the current is pulling in the opposite direction. A man named Abraham Brown, a small, wiry cooper with a fiery zeal and the kind of eyes that never quite drop a gaze, rises from his bench. He isn't a minister, he isn't wealthy, he simply has a question. Magistrate Brown, Brown's voice cuts through the murmuring, its edge sharpened by years of fighting for every scrap he owns. We are here to vote, but I must ask, by what right do we assent to laws that we did not ourselves have a voice in framing? The room goes silent. This isn't just a challenge to Dudley, it's a challenge to the entire political order of Europe. It is the sound of the foundation of empire cracking. Dudley's face, already severe, darkens further. The right, Mr. Brown, is conferred by the Charter and by the will of God, as administered by his chosen, upright servants. Brown takes a step forward, planting his feet firmly in the middle of the earthen floor. We left England to escape the tyranny of the king and his parliament, he states, his voice rising now, not in anger, but in conviction. And yet, here we are expected to follow the mandates of a government, our own government, that passes taxes and laws without our consent or knowledge. That, sir, is taxation without representation. The phrase hangs there, taxation without representation. It won't be famous for another 130 years, but on that frigid night in Watertown, it was a spark thrown into a barrel of gunpowder. Dudley begins to rail, arguing that the town meeting, their local gathering, was merely an administrative tool, a simple mechanism for collecting taxes and regulating fences, not a legislature. But Abraham Brown and the men around him had already tasted the intoxicating power of direct democracy. They were doing more than regulating fences. They were deciding who could join their community, how much a pig could stray, which roads would be built, and who would teach their children. They were passing their own laws, setting their own penalties, and electing their own local officials, the selectmen, whose authority on local matters they considered superior to even the magistrates. In Massachusetts, the concept of the town meeting was supposed to be a loyal local limb of the central government, but fueled by Puritan zeal for communal purity, a deep English heritage of local jurisdiction, and the sheer necessity of survival in the wilderness, it had become something dangerously new, a micro-republic. It was a machine of local power, forged in the heat of necessity and driven by the fierce, independent spirit of common men who would not be subjects again. This machine, running on the fuel of open debate and majority vote, would become the central operating system of the colony, the foundation upon which all other American liberty would be built. It was messy, often brutal, and profoundly powerful, and it had just begun to run. What would you like to call the next chapter? The seed of sovereignty, or the tyranny of the majority? The Puritan vision for Massachusetts Bay was simple: a unified, ordered society, a city upon a hill, governed by the righteous and the educated. But the very geography of New England, sparse settlement separated by poor roads and terrain, demanded decentralization. The colonists couldn't wait for Boston's magistrates to settle a land boundary dispute in Ipswich or approve a new ferry in Salem. Necessity, as always, was the mother of political invention. The formal mechanism that empowered Abraham Brown and his Watertown neighbors was established not through grand philosophical debate, but through dry, practical legislation. In 1636, the General Court passed an act that solidified the town meeting's existence and, crucially, defined its powers. This was the moment the town meeting machine was given its engine and its chassis. The power of the petition. The foundation of the machine was the warrant. Unlike European governance, where orders flowed down from the sovereign, the town meeting was convened by a public notice, often posted on the meeting house door or read aloud after Sunday service. This warrant listed every single item to be debated and voted upon, the articles, from taxing livestock to setting the constable's salary. This meant the central government couldn't sneak legislation past the people. If it wasn't on the warrant, it couldn't be voted on. This simple legal restriction gave the populace ultimate control over their agenda. It was the first and most enduring firewall against distant executive power. The selectmen, local executives. To execute the will of the meeting, citizens selected a small group of their neighbors, usually 3 or 5, known as the selectmen. These men, and they were exclusively men at this time, were the town's daily executives. They were the local face of power, not appointed by a distant royal governor, but chosen by the collective vote of their peers. The selectmen were responsible for everything: the purse, managing local budgets, setting spending priorities, and assessing taxes based on the meeting's vote; the land, regulating the allocation of common land and resolving property disputes; the people, monitoring community morality, issuing warnings to undesirable newcomers, ensuring the town didn't become a burden on its poorer citizens, and ensuring every child received an education. Their power was immense, yet entirely accountable. They had to report back to the next town meeting, standing before the very people who could vote them out of office. This cycle of power, elected, given authority, and then forced to stand for scrutiny, was the essence of the blueprint of local power. The freemen versus the inhabitants. Who got to vote? This was the pivotal question that shaped the early Massachusetts experiment. Initially, voting rights were strictly limited to freemen, male, landowning members of the official Puritan Church. This was not pure democracy, it was a theocratic republic. If you weren't right with God, as judged by the local minister, you couldn't vote for your town's representative. However, the sheer necessity of local administration quickly forced an expansion of suffrage, at least for town matters. While freemen controlled the selection of colony-wide representatives, inhabitants, any adult male who wasn't necessarily a church member, were often granted the right to vote on purely local financial issues, setting the schoolmaster's pay, fixing the town pump, or maintaining the bridge. This distinction created an interesting tension. Central power, theocracy, restricted to freemen to maintain Puritan religious control. Local power, pragmatism, gradually expanded to inhabitants because everyone had a stake in local roads and taxes. The town meeting became the crucible where de facto power, who pays the taxes and does the work, wrestled with de jure power, who has the formal legal right. Over time, the pragmatic needs of the local community chipped away at the theological restrictions of the central government, planting a seed of popular sovereignty that would later bloom into full-fledged American democracy. In these crowded, often loud meetings, men were learning through direct participation the complex, messy art of self-rule. They were learning to compromise, to persuade, and to live with the difficult outcome of the majority's decision. This continuous, compulsory political education was the true legacy of the town meeting machine, preparing a generation to eventually demand self-governance on a continental scale. Would you like to explore how these town meetings became centers of resistance against the British Crown in the next chapter, The Crucible of Rebellion?
For over a century, the Massachusetts town meetings operated in a state of productive ambiguity. They governed the local reality, while the King and Parliament in London claimed ultimate theoretical authority. But in the 1760s, as the Crown sought to recoup the massive debts incurred during the French and Indian War, this comfortable ambiguity shattered. The British began passing a series of acts, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, designed to assert Parliament's full sovereignty over the colonies. London made a fatal miscalculation. They saw the American colonies as a single, disembodied entity. They failed to understand that the true political life of Massachusetts resided not in the colonial capital of Boston, but in the dozens of fiercely autonomous micro-republics across the countryside. The network activates. When the news of the Stamp Act, 1765, reached the colonies, the town meetings reacted instantly and simultaneously. The Stamp Act, which required all legal documents and most printed materials to bear a tax stamp, was not just an economic burden, it was a direct assault on the legal and administrative functions managed by the towns themselves. The selectmen and the freemen, veterans of decades of intense, structured debate, knew exactly how to proceed. They didn't need to riot immediately, they needed to convene. Across Massachusetts, warrants were issued and townspeople gathered. What emerged was a synchronized, unified, and legal protest. The votes passed in these meetings were the first truly powerful statements of colonial resistance. Refusal to comply. Towns voted unanimously to instruct their court officers, lawyers, and printers not to use the stamped paper, effectively nullifying the Act's local enforcement. Instructions to representatives. They formally instructed their delegates in the General Court, the colonial legislature, to stand firm against the Act. Crucially, these instructions often carried the implicit threat of recall. A representative who failed to follow the will of his town would be summarily replaced. This established a direct, unbreakable chain of accountability from the smallest town gathering up to the highest provincial authority. This process was more effective than any spontaneous uprising. It was organized, legally documented, and carried the weight of hundreds of majority votes. It told the British that resistance was not merely the noise of a few angry radicals in Boston, but the mandate of the entire body politic. The Committee of Correspondence. The town meeting machine was now a communication network. The system, however, was still vulnerable to being shut down by the royal governor. To ensure the continuity of resistance, Samuel Adams, a master political strategist from Boston, championed a brilliant structural innovation in 1772, the Committee of Correspondence. The Boston Town Meeting established the first of these committees. Its purpose was simple: to state the rights of the colonists and to communicate and publish the same to the several towns. This innovation was quickly replicated. Over the next year, nearly every town in Massachusetts elected its own Committee of Correspondence. These weren't official government bodies, they were extra-legal, revolutionary committees sanctioned only by the vote of the local town meeting. The blueprint. If Boston needed to coordinate a response to a new British tax, its committee would dispatch riders carrying official town-voted resolutions. The relay. The riders would deliver the resolutions to the committees in Lexington, Concord, and Worcester. The action. Each receiving committee would then issue a warrant to convene its own local town meeting where the proposal would be debated, amended, and voted upon. This network created a shadow government, a self-organizing, rapid response political system that bypassed the authority of the royal governor entirely. The British could dismiss the general court, but they could not dissolve hundreds of sovereign local town meetings. When the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts in 1774, specifically attempting to suppress the town meetings by forbidding them from convening without the governor's permission, they only accelerated the revolution. The towns simply ignored the order. The town meetings, defiant and energized, became illegal assemblies operating openly against the crown. The town meeting machine, perfected over a century of managing local disputes, had become the organizational structure of a rebellion. It was the precise, disciplined mechanism that turned scattered individual resentment into a unified, armed political movement. For the next chapter, would you like to explore the model of America, how the town meeting structure influenced the U.S. Constitution, or focus on the town meeting's legacy, the challenges and endurance of direct democracy today? The men who gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to draft the U.S. Constitution were not inventing a government from scratch. They were practical politicians, deeply versed in the political mechanisms that had governed their lives for decades. And for the delegates from New England, men like John Adams, who called the town meeting the best school of liberty the world ever saw, the model was already perfected in miniature. The town meeting machine, having successfully organized a rebellion and managed the affairs of state during the Revolutionary War, now offered a fundamental blueprint for structuring power in the new republic. The separation of powers, local style. The most profound lesson the founders took from the town meeting was the necessity of separation of powers and accountability. In every single town, they had a functioning system with clear checks and balances. The legislative branch, the town meeting, this was the direct sovereign power. It made the laws, set the budget, and defined the community's will. It was pure democracy. The executive branch, the selectmen, this elected board was responsible for executing the laws passed by the meeting. They could not create policy, only implement it. Crucially, they were instantly accountable to the next meeting. The judicial and administrative branch, the constables and juries, they enforced the peace and oversaw the fair application of community standards and taxes, again under the scrutiny of the voters. When James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and the others designed the federal government, they simply scaled up this familiar, working model. The Congress, the legislative, would debate and pass laws, just like the town meeting. The president, the executive, would administer those laws, just like the selectmen. The power of the article and the agenda. The town meeting's use of the warrant, which required every subject to be publicly advertised and voted upon, provided a practical template for ensuring legislative transparency. This concept found expression in the Constitution in several ways, most notably in the democratic expectation that representatives must clearly articulate their proposals and that the legislative process must be open to public scrutiny. Furthermore, the relationship between the town meeting, the people, and their local representative in the colonial legislature, the General Court, was the ultimate example of mandated representation. Town representatives were routinely given instructions by the voters and could be replaced if they strayed too far from the town's will. This relentless focus on the local mandate fueled the eventual demand for the Bill of Rights. The founders, having seen how easily central power could disregard local sentiment, as the king and parliament had done, insisted on formal amendments that guaranteed liberties. These guarantees were fundamentally about protecting the local, individual right to assemble, debate, and petition the government, the very rights exercised in every town meeting. The town meeting and federalism. The genius of American federalism, the division of power between a national government and state governments, can be traced back to the distinction between the town meeting's authority and the general court's authority. The town meeting retained power over all local matters: education, roads, fences, welfare. The general court handled province-wide issues, military defense, major treaties, larger judicial matters. This division was replicated in the U.S. Constitution's 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. The people, in this context, often referred to the local political units, the towns. The town meeting served as the practical training ground for the entire political class that built the nation. It taught John Adams the power of the vote, gave Samuel Adams the organizational structure for rebellion, and instilled in generations of New Englanders the core belief that legitimate authority flows up from the people, not down from the ruling elite. For the final chapter, we can address the endurance and evolution of this democratic system, the legacy and the limit. Would you like to explore how the town meeting machine functions in the 21st century and the debates over direct versus representative democracy?
It is 1765. The air in the cramped wooden meeting house in Ipswich, Massachusetts, does not smell of pine and liberty. It smells of sweat, spilled cider, and the slow-burning fear of a people realizing their masters live 3,000 miles away. The room is silent, the kind of silence that doesn't just absorb noise, but amplifies the frantic drumming of 1,000 hearts. John Adams, then a young, fiery lawyer from Braintree, clutches a sheaf of papers, his knuckles white. He is here not as an agitator, but as a messenger of a new, unsettling gospel. The Stamp Act is coming. A grizzled fisherman, his face etched by the Atlantic wind, finally breaks the stillness. "So," he rasps, his voice a dry leaf, "the King's Parliament in London says we must pay a tax on every piece of paper, every deed, every pamphlet, even the indenture of my son?" Adams nods, his eyes fixed on the man. "Indeed, they say they represent us, that they have the sovereign right to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever." The fisherman doesn't look at Adams. He looks at the 200 men packed into the room, farmers and coopers, merchants and sailors, all holding their breath. He looks at the simple wooden box in the center of the hall, the ballot box, the repository of their collective decision. He doesn't argue law or precedent. He simply points a calloused finger at the box and then to the sea, toward London. "They may have their parliament," he declares, his voice now rising to a thunder, "but we have this, and who amongst them will tell this town meeting how to vote?" The fisherman's question, simple and profound, hangs over the nascent rebellion like the smoke from a revolutionary cannon. This humble, chaotic, utterly democratic institution, the Massachusetts town meeting, was not merely a legislative body. It was a crucible forging the very concept of American self-governance. It was where farmers argued with judges, where the apprentice had the same right to the floor as the merchant, and where, unlike London, no one represented you but you. This system, born of Puritan covenant and frontier necessity, had spent a century and a half perfecting its mechanics. Every March, every September, and every time the Crown stirred up trouble, the men of the town would gather. They would argue over everything: how many shillings to pay the schoolmaster, whether the road to Deacon Peabody's farm should be mended, if the town swine should be allowed to run at large. They elected selectmen, 3 to 5 of their own, trusted neighbors who served as the executive branch. They appointed fence viewers, hog reeves, sealers of leather, and a man whose sole job was to make sure the town's common supply of gunpowder was kept dry. This was democracy, not as a lofty ideal whispered by philosophers, but a gritty, deeply practical job, the town's business. But in 1765, the town meeting was no longer just mending fences, it was building a foundation for a new republic. The question of the Stamp Act required more than just a yes or no vote. It demanded a warrant, the official agenda that would define the town's response. A warrant was not merely issued, it was agreed upon by the people themselves. In Ipswich, the moderator, a tall, silent shipbuilder, finally rapped his cane against the floor. "The question before the floor," he announced, the words echoing, "is whether we shall instruct our representative in the General Court to refuse compliance with the Stamp Act, and further, whether we shall draft a document declaring the inherent right of our town to govern its own affairs." Adams watched the faces. He saw the doubt, the fear of retribution, but above all, he saw the slow, dawning realization of their power. The collective decision of 200 ordinary men, each holding one vote, was about to send a shockwave across the Atlantic. The decision made in this small room, sealed by the selectmen's careful script in the town record book, would soon become a blueprint, a machine of local power that would replicate itself across every town in Massachusetts, transforming a regional protest into a unified, colony-wide rejection of imperial rule. The town meeting machine was about to go operational. The political explosion witnessed in Ipswich did not happen in a vacuum. The town meeting machine, so effectively engaged against the Stamp Act, was the result of over a century of deliberate, theologically driven local organization. To understand the American Revolution, one must first understand the Puritan covenant. The city upon a hill. The men and women who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1630s were not seeking simple economic freedom. They were seeking a place to practice their faith without compromise. Their leader, John Winthrop, famously declared their venture must be a city upon a hill, a model community bound by God's laws and built on mutual agreement. This concept of agreement was critical. Unlike the established Church of England, the Puritan congregation was formed by a covenant, a solemn, written contract among believers. This contract stated that they would freely associate, abide by common rules, and select their own ministers and magistrates. When they stepped ashore, they didn't just found churches, they founded towns, and they applied the exact same contractual principle. The town meeting was in essence the secular extension of the church covenant, drawing the lines, land and power. The early system was ruthlessly efficient. The General Court, the colonial legislature, would grant a petitioning group of families a large tract of land. Before a single house could be built, they had to organize. They were given specific instructions: lay out lots, build a meeting house, and appoint officers. This act of laying out lots was the first step toward democratic accountability. Unlike the scattered plantations of the South, Massachusetts towns were compact. The inhabitants lived close to the center, within walking distance of the central meeting house. Why did this matter politically? Because the voter pool was defined by land ownership. To be a freeman, and later to be a voter, you had to own property and be accepted by the community. Since the community itself distributed the land, the power structure was immediately localized. The General Court in Boston could grant the land, but the town meeting decided who got which lot. The warrant, democracy on paper. The core mechanism ensuring local power was the warrant. If a citizen had an issue, a stray bull, an unmended road, or a political crisis like the Stamp Act, they could petition the selectmen to warn a town meeting. The selectmen were then obligated to post a notice,
the warrant, detailing the specific issues to be discussed. This warrant system was the first major innovation in American local governance. Transparency. Nothing could be discussed or voted upon that was not explicitly listed on the warrant. This prevented backroom deals and surprise votes. Participation. It forced citizens to know exactly what business was being conducted before they showed up, ensuring informed debate. Accountability. The selectmen, though executives, were held accountable by the very document they produced. If they tried to sneak a controversial item past the people, they could be censured. The warrant transformed the chaotic idea of direct democracy into a systematic, documented, and legally defensible process. The power was not in the hands of the selectmen who ran the meeting, nor the moderator who kept order. The power resided in the articles, the numbered items on the warrant that had to be resolved, one by one. By the 1760s, these towns were not just local entities, they were interconnected, self-regulating cells. When Boston reacted to a Crown policy, they issued a warrant. When Roxbury or Marblehead saw that warrant, they issued their own, often copying the precise wording of the articles, ensuring a colonial front of unified protest. The machine was built. Now it only needed the fuel of imperial resistance to show its full, terrifying power to the British Crown.
The British Parliament viewed the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a single unitary body controlled from Boston by the royal governor. They grossly underestimated the power of the local executive, the selectmen. If the town meeting was the legislature, the voice of the people, the selectmen were the nervous, profoundly important executive branch. They were the ones who had to take the will of the Democratic Assembly and translate it into practical action, a task fraught with political peril, both from the Crown and from their hyper-vigilant neighbors. The humble seat of power. Typically, a board of 3 to 7 respected townsmen, the selectmen were elected annually. Their job description was vast, encompassing nearly all administrative functions. Financial stewards, they assessed and collected local taxes, maintained the town treasury, and paid the town's bills for the schoolmaster, the minister, and road repairs. Keepers of order, they issued licenses for taverns and ferries, oversaw the care of the poor, and ensured the town's public records were meticulously kept. The gates of the town. Crucially, they were the ones who decided who could warn out a newcomer. If a poor, unattached individual arrived in town, the selectmen could legally warn them out, preventing them from becoming the town's financial responsibility. This control over who belonged was the ultimate expression of local sovereignty. A job nobody wanted. Despite the immense power these men held, being a selectman was often an unwelcome duty. It was unpaid, time-consuming, and guaranteed to make you unpopular. Imagine the selectman's dilemma. The town meeting votes to cut the schoolmaster's salary, a decision the selectman knows will lead to the education of the town's children suffering. Yet his duty is not to his own judgment, but to the expressed will of the body. Furthermore, they were under constant scrutiny. Every financial transaction, every land decision, every shilling spent was recorded in the town book, which was open for public inspection. If the selectmen dared to act outside the authority granted by the warrant and the subsequent vote, they faced a swift public reckoning at the next meeting. This system instilled a profound sense of reluctance and accountability in the executive. They did not lead the town, they administered the decisions of the town. This was the exact opposite of the centralized aristocratic government structure of Great Britain, where powerful ministers could rule without direct recourse to the people. Transforming treason into town business. When the resistance against British policy began, the selectmen became the linchpin. They had to walk a razor-thin line between colonial law and imperial authority. When the Stamp Act or the Tea Act inflamed the colony, the town meeting would pass resolutions that were essentially acts of treason against the crown. It was the selectmen's job to record the treason. They had to officially transcribe the seditious votes and instructions into the official legally binding town record book. Then act on the treason. They were then responsible for communicating the town's refusal to pay taxes or their decision to boycott goods to other towns and to the colonial legislature in Boston. They became the communication network of the Revolution. By following the due process of the town meeting, by simply recording and implementing the public vote, the selectmen provided a legal cover for revolutionary acts. They could argue to a royal official, "I am merely executing the will of the town, as recorded in our minutes. I have no personal authority in this matter." Thus, the humble selectman, elected to count pigs and fix roads, became the reluctant architect of rebellion, using the mundane machinery of local administration to dismantle the British Empire. Would you like to move on to Chapter 4, The General Court versus the People, the Erosion of Central Authority? The town meeting machine was so effective because it operated on a power dynamic utterly alien to the British system. Power flowed from the local up to the central, not the reverse. The Massachusetts General Court, the colony's bicameral legislature sitting in Boston, was supposed to be the central authority, but in reality, it was dependent on the towns for its very legitimacy. Representatives as messengers. The General Court consisted of two parts: the Council, appointed or elected by the House, and the House of Representatives, elected directly by the towns. The crucial distinction lay in the role of the representative. In the British tradition, a member of Parliament represented the entire realm, regardless of where they were elected. They were expected to use their independent judgment. In Massachusetts, however, the representative was viewed strictly as an agent or messenger of the town that elected him. The town meeting did not just elect a representative, it passed instructions. These instructions were meticulously drafted, debated, and voted upon, and they were legally binding on the representative. They dictated exactly how he was to vote on specific issues, especially concerning taxes, salaries, and fundamental rights. If the representative strayed from his town's instructions, he risked being recalled and publicly disgraced. This relationship meant that the General Court was not an independent, centralized power. It was a convention of instructed agents. When a political crisis erupted, the debate didn't happen in Boston. It happened simultaneously in dozens of cramped meeting houses across the colony. The vote in the General Court was merely the aggregation of the votes already cast by hundreds of individual town meetings. The Circular Letter Network. The power of the town meeting was formalized during the escalating crisis of the 1960s. When Samuel Adams and others in Boston sought to rally colonial resistance against British new taxes, like the Townshend Acts, they didn't rely solely on the General Court. They went directly to the towns. They devised the Circular Letter, a document drafted by the Boston Town Meeting that outlined the grievance and proposed a unified action, such as a boycott. Boston then dispatched this letter to the selectmen of every other town in the colony. Upon receiving the letter, the selectmen were compelled to issue a warrant. They had to call a special town meeting, debate the article. The meeting would debate the issue raised in the circular letter, vote a response. The town would vote to adopt, amend, or reject the proposed action, instruct the representative. The vote would become a direct instruction to their representative in the General Court. This town-to-town communication network bypassed the royal governor and often defied the rulings of the General Court when it was under pressure from the Crown. It created an immediate, powerful consensus from the ground up, making Massachusetts uniquely capable of unified resistance. The tyranny of the majority. This intense local control, however, had a darker side. The town meeting's absolute power could easily be used to enforce conformity.
A person who spoke out against the majority's decision on the Stamp Act or the non-importation agreements risked social and economic ruin. The machine that guaranteed local liberty also served as a tool for local tyranny. When the town meeting voted a boycott, the selectmen and appointed committees of inspection, another town-level office, were empowered to search and seize prescribed goods. Merchants who tried to trade with Britain were publicly shamed, often covered in tar and feathers, and effectively ruined. By 1774, the town meeting machine had become a parallel government, one that the British Crown could not reach and the General Court could not truly control. Its local democratic process had weaponized the entire population, transforming ordinary citizens into agents of revolution. The ultimate test of the machine's durability, total war, was fast approaching.
With the town meeting as the local engine of power, the colonists required a mechanism to connect these disparate engines into a single, cohesive network. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating to the imperial administration: the Committees of Correspondence, or COCs. The network architect. While the idea of intercolonial communication was not new, the architect who institutionalized it within the democratic framework of the town meeting was Samuel Adams. Adams understood that to effectively resist the crown, the towns needed a permanent, rapid communication system that bypassed the royal governor and his controlled general court. In 1772, when the British announced they would pay the salaries of judges and the governor directly from the crown, thereby removing them from the financial control of the colonial assembly, Boston reacted with fury. The Boston Town Meeting, under Adams' guidance, voted to form the first permanent Committee of Correspondence. The COC was not a new branch of government. It was an ad hoc committee elected by the town meeting to perform a single critical function: communication. Its members were tasked with corresponding with their counterparts in other Massachusetts towns and, eventually, with committees in other colonies. The operational machine. The process was simple yet revolutionary. Town action. A town, such as Boston or Marblehead, would convene a town meeting to debate an imperial act, e.g. the Tea Act. The meeting would pass a resolution defining their stance and their plan of action, e.g. boycotting tea. COC drafts. The local COC would immediately draft a concise letter containing the town's resolution and their political rationale. Dissemination. Couriers, often chosen from the town's younger, most dependable citizens, would ride immediately to neighboring towns, delivering the letter to their respective COCs or selectmen. Replication. The receiving selectman would call a town meeting based on the letter. The meeting would debate the issue and likely form its own COC and pass a similar resolution. They would then dispatch the letter onward to the next town. This effectively created a revolutionary telegraph system. News and policy directives, drafted by the grassroots, could travel from Boston to the far reaches of the colony in a matter of days, ensuring that all towns were marching in lockstep. The de facto government. By 1774, when the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which the colonists dubbed the Intolerable Acts, in response to the Boston Tea Party, the Crown attempted to shut down the town meeting machine entirely. The Massachusetts Government Act specifically restricted town meetings to only one assembly per year, in May, for the purpose of electing town officers, and banned them from discussing any political matter without the royal governor's express permission. The response was magnificent defiance. The selectmen defy. Selectmen across Massachusetts, citing the long-established rights encoded in their town charters, simply ignored the governor's edict. They continued to issue warrants and call meetings. The town meeting evolved. When royal officials tried to stop the meetings, the towns didn't meet formally.
They convened as the body of the people, or as conventions outside the official meeting house, passing resolutions that were just as binding. The COCs take over. The network of COCs, which now included virtually every organized settlement, seamlessly stepped in as the executive and administrative body. They coordinated the collection of arms and ammunition, organized colonial militia, the Minutemen, and enforced the economic boycott. They became, for all practical purposes, the shadow government of Massachusetts. The Crown's attempt to sever the head of the revolution, the General Court in Boston, failed because the body was already decentralized. The town meeting machine, networked by the committees of correspondence, had ensured that the revolution was not merely a Boston-based revolt, but a unified, colony-wide act of collective local power. The final physical manifestation of the town meeting machine's power was the Minutemen. When the revolution transitioned from debates and resolutions to musket fire, it was the local governance structure, not a centralized colonial army, that mobilized the fighting force. The militia, a town obligation. Long before the resistance, the obligation for every able-bodied man to serve in the local militia was a fundamental part of town meeting governance. The selectmen, under the direction of the town meeting, were responsible for maintaining the town's military readiness. They managed the powder house, the common magazine of gunpowder and shot, and ensured the town kept an updated roster of all eligible men. Crucially, the officers of the local militia company, the captain and lieutenants, were not appointed by the royal governor. They were often elected by the militiamen themselves or confirmed by the selectmen. This deep link between the military structure and the town's democracy ensured loyalty rested with the local community, not the distant crown. The birth of the Minutemen. As tensions heightened after the Coercive Acts, 1774, the committees of correspondence began urging the towns to take extraordinary military measures. The town meetings responded by officially voting to reorganize their militia companies. The resolution passed by countless town meetings went something like this: that 1/4 of the men enrolled in the town's militia company shall be chosen by voluntary enlistment or otherwise to be prepared at the shortest notice to march. These were the Minutemen. This reorganization wasn't a secret military maneuver. It was an official town meeting appropriation. The town voted to fund the Minutemen, allocate local tax money, shillings and pounds, to pay for their drills and equipment, procure supplies, instruct the selectmen and the new committees of safety, another town-created body, to purchase specific amounts of powder, flints, and lead, appoint officers, elect the most reliable men as their officers, bypassing any appointed by the royal authority that was now defunct. The result was an army that was decentralized, locally financed, and democratically controlled. The Ride and the Rally. On the night of April 18, 1775, the town meeting machine was put to the ultimate test. When Paul Revere and William Dawes rode out of Boston, they were not just spreading a warning, they were activating a political and military infrastructure that had been perfected for a century. Their message was delivered to the committees of safety and the selectmen in towns like Lexington and Concord. The alarm. The town official, often the selectman or a COC member, received the alarm. The signal. The church bell was rung or the alarm gun was fired, a signal that every citizen recognized as the summons of the town meeting. The muster. Men gathered on the town common, the same ground where town meetings were often held, already carrying the arms and powder that the town meeting had obligated them to possess. When the British troops marched into Lexington at dawn on April 19, 1775, they were not met by a colonial army. They were met by the embodiment of local self-governance. The men on the green were neighbors, debtors and creditors, farmers and blacksmiths, standing shoulder to shoulder,
legally convened and armed by the vote of their own town meeting. The confrontation was the moment the blueprint of local power became a battle plan. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord were the result of dozens of town meetings, hundreds of warrants, and thousands of locally cast votes, finally mobilized as an army of citizen legislators.
The successful mobilization of the town meeting machine during the early days of the Revolution immediately posed a new, critical challenge. How could a new central government be created without extinguishing the fiercely independent local power that had made the victory possible? The experience of the town meeting, where sovereignty resided in the assembled people, became the fundamental blueprint for structuring the new state and federal governments. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. The first laboratory for translating the town meeting ideal into a large-scale government was the drafting of the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. This document, largely written by John Adams, the same young lawyer from Chapter 1, is arguably the most direct legal descendant of the town meeting. It enshrined several key principles learned from 2 centuries of local governments. Written fundamental law. The people had always governed by the written authority of the warrant and the town record book. Adams ensured the government would be governed by a written constitution ratified by the people, not just the legislature. Separation of powers. The town meeting naturally separated the legislative, the assembled voters, the executive, the selectmen, and the judicial, the justices of peace. Adams imported this tripartite structure into the state government, designing checks and balances to prevent the tyranny of a single branch. The right of instruction. Although controversial at the state level, the town meeting tradition ensured that the notion of the representative as an instructed agent of the people was powerful. While the new state constitution didn't mandate instructions, it relied heavily on the idea that political legitimacy flowed upward from the citizens to their elected officials, from local warrants to federal rights. When the former colonies gathered to draft the U.S. Constitution, many of the delegates, particularly those from New England, carried the ingrained habits of the town meeting. These habits ensured a focus on explicit limits on central power and a clear enumeration of the people's rights. The fear was simple. If King George III could not tax or dictate to the towns, neither could a new Congress in Philadelphia. 2 specific features of the town meeting tradition deeply influenced the resulting federal structure. 1. The right of assembly and petition. The town meeting was the public assembly. Its legitimacy relied on the freedom of citizens to convene and petition their elected officials, the selectmen, the representative, the governor, for redress. This right, central to local governance, was codified in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. 2. Local control over the militia. The Minutemen experience proved that a strong, locally controlled militia was the ultimate defense against centralized tyranny. This ethos was the driving force behind the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The phrase well-regulated militia refers directly to the local, democratically organized and town-funded militia system that existed in Massachusetts. The goal was not simply individual armament, but the maintenance of the people's collective local military capacity, the armed wing of the town meeting. The enduring legacy. The ultimate triumph of the town meeting was its ability to survive the transition to a large-scale republic. while Massachusetts eventually adopted a system where many towns grew too large for direct democracy and transitioned to representative town meetings, where elected delegates vote on behalf of the town, the core principle endured. The town meeting served as the necessary training ground for the democratic habits of the nation: how to debate a controversial issue respectfully, how to manage a budget, how to elect and hold an executive accountable, and how to define liberty through a collective vote. The machine that began in the cramped, smoky meeting houses of Puritan Massachusetts didn't just win a war, it provided the operating system for a democratic republic. Once the town meeting machine had secured independence and its core principles were integrated into the state constitution, a new tension arose. The machine was designed for a small, homogeneous community. As Massachusetts grew geographically and in population, its core model of direct democracy faced the practical limitations of scale, triggering a profound and enduring debate. Can pure democracy survive in a large republic? The geography of discontent. By the late 18th century, the town meeting was becoming unwieldy in larger, denser communities like Boston, Salem, and Marblehead. Imagine trying to debate the annual budget with 10,000 people packed into a single hall. The meetings often devolved into chaos, shouted arguments, and rushed votes. The principle of equal participation was being undermined by sheer numbers. Furthermore, new settlements were expanding westward. These new towns often lacked the old Puritan homogeneity. They were diverse, struggling economically, and felt distant from the established political and economic elite of coastal Massachusetts. They viewed the Boston-centric state government and even the coastal town meetings with deep suspicion. Shays' Rebellion, the town meeting on the march. The financial crisis following the Revolutionary War exposed the fragility of the new representative government. Farmers in western Massachusetts, many of whom were veterans, faced crippling debt and foreclosures. They felt that the new state legislature, meeting in Boston, had betrayed the town meeting principle. They argued that the government was prioritizing wealthy creditors over the average citizen, imposing high taxes without adequately addressing the people's financial distress. Their response was a dramatic activation of the town meeting ethos. Conventions. The aggrieved towns bypassed the general court and organized illegal county conventions. These were regional meetings functioning exactly like an expanded town meeting, debating grievances and passing resolutions against the state government. Petitions. The conventions initially sought redress through peaceful petitions, the very mechanism used to call a town meeting. But when the petitions were ignored, the people turned to armed force. The insurrection, led by Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain, was the ultimate expression of direct local power, using force to nullify the actions of a distant, unrepresentative authority. The state government, led by Governor Bowdoin, viewed this as a dangerous anarchy, a perverse misuse of the democratic spirit. They argued that the people's voice was already represented by the legislature. The rebels retorted that the legislature had ignored the instructions of the western towns. The rise of the representative town meeting. Shays' Rebellion was ultimately suppressed, but it served as a terrifying warning to the founding generation. Pure direct democracy, when scaled up or when facing deep factional divisions, risks instability. The long-term solution adopted by Massachusetts was a pragmatic compromise that preserved the spirit of local power while addressing the chaos of scale. The representative town meeting. In 1915, the town of Brookline, Massachusetts, pioneered this new model, which many large towns eventually adopted. Preserving the warrant. The meeting still operates based on the warrant, ensuring transparency and limiting debate to predefined articles. Electing delegates. Instead of every registered voter attending, citizens in specific precincts elect a small group of town meeting members, delegates, who represent the local area and attend the meeting. Final say. The delegates debate and vote on the budget, bylaws, and other articles, just as the original town meeting did. This structural innovation allowed the town to maintain legislative self-sufficiency, the ability to pass its own local laws and budget, while moving toward a more manageable representative debate. It was a conscious effort to keep the town meeting machine running, accepting representation to avoid dissolution. The debate of Chapter 8, direct citizen control versus stable representative governance, continues to define American politics, with the Massachusetts town meeting providing both the original democratic model and the first successful attempt at reconciling its conflicting demands.